string theory, or rules exist for a reason. There is a category of problem that the army does not officially acknowledge, which is the problem of things that are supposed to be somewhere else. Doctrine covers enemies. It covers friendly forces. It covers terrain, weather, equipment failure, and the various ways in which a plan survives contact with reality for approximately as long as it takes reality to read it. What doctrine does not cover? Because doctrine is written by people with a reasonable expectation of what turns up on a battlefield, is the civilian family on a footpath at 2 in the morning, arguing about whether they took a wrong turn at the last stile, with a child who has stopped engaging with the question entirely and is communicating exclusively through the medium of footsteps. But I am getting ahead of myself. The family comes later. First, there is Pembrokeshire, which in August had no business being as hot as it was, and a landing craft, and the Arctic rations. Someone, at some point in the logistics chain, had decided that the unit going ashore in Pembrokeshire in the hottest summer in recent memory would be sustained for the duration of the exercise on Arctic rations. Arctic rations are designed for men operating in extreme cold, burning enormous quantities of calories to stay warm, with snow available for water in quantities that exceed demand. They are calorie-dense, heavily spiced, and in the particular heatwave that had settled over South Wales that August, they were approximately as appropriate as a wetsuit at a dinner party. They were also, and this is the detail that made them dangerous, genuinely delicious. A man who has been tabbing since dawn in 30-degree heat, who has sweated out roughly his own body weight in water and has been issued a ration pack that is essentially a selection of excellent curries, will eat the curries. This is not a failure of discipline. It is a failure of institutional foresight, because the curries require water to reconstitute, consume water to digest, and return water to the environment by routes that in a properly hydrated man are entirely unremarkable, and in a dehydrated one are the subject of urgent and undignified attention at some considerable distance from anything that might be described as a facility. By the second day, several men had been returned to a more liquid state than they had arrived in. The exercise continued. The rations continued. They were there, and they were good, and the consequences, while immediate and emphatic, were at least temporary. We moved, we stopped, we ate more curry, we slept in the way that men sleep when sleep is a tactical allocation rather than a human need, briefly, lightly, and with one ear still pointed at the dark, in case the dark had developed an agenda. By the third night, the tiredness had stopped being a feeling and become a condition. There is a threshold, known to anyone who has been on the wrong side of it, beyond which the brain begins to negotiate with reality on terms that reality has not consented to. I had crossed it some hours before we got into position, which is relevant, because the position was an ambush, and an ambush requires you to distinguish between things that are there and things that your exhausted mind has decided to put there as a courtesy. I was the left-hand cut-off. This means I was the leftmost point of the line, with a string running back to the ambush commander and another string, somewhere to my right, held by the right-hand cut-off, who would pull it when the enemy came in from his side. The string was the system. The killing zone lay in front of us, dark and patient and empty, and had been dark and patient and empty for what was supposed to be 20 minutes, but had become, by any honest reckoning, something considerably closer to 2 hours. I had watched the tree line opposite develop, over that time, the full range of personalities available to a tree line in the middle of the night to a man who has not slept properly in 3 days. It had been threatening, then conspiratorial, then faintly judgmental, and had settled, by the time I heard the noise, into a kind of sardonic composure as though it knew something I didn't, and had decided to wait. The noise was metallic, irregular, unhurried, the particular percussion of equipment that has not been secured and is making no effort to conceal this. My first thought was that the hallucinations had graduated to audio, which would have been a new development and not a welcome one. My second thought was that my hallucinations had not, until this point, made noise, and that the noise was therefore probably real and coming from the right. I checked the string. The string had not moved. What I heard next resolved the question in a direction I had not anticipated. It was a voice, not a military voice, not the compressed, minimum necessary communication of men who are supposed to be somewhere and know it, but a full-throated domestic disagreement about navigation, delivered with the fluency of a couple who have had this particular argument many times before and have developed a shorthand for it. A second voice, a pause. The first voice again, making a point, and beneath both of them the footsteps of a child communicating its displeasure through gait alone, with the specific rhythm of small feet that have been walking longer than was advertised and have opinions about this that they are no longer bothering to articulate. Then I saw them. Father first, with the pack and the pots. The pots hung on the outside, clanking softly with each step, the source of the metallic percussion that had been the closest thing to a warning they'd offered. Mother behind him, still talking. Child behind her, still protesting by foot. They walked through the killing zone with the unhurried confidence of people following a footpath, which is what they were doing, because the Pembrokeshire coast path does not reroute itself for ambushes, and nobody had informed it of our presence. I had my safety catch-off. I want to be precise about this, because the precise sequence is the point. I had made a decision some minutes earlier, in a state of sleep deprivation, watching a tree line that had been making faces at me for the better part of 2 hours, that if the ambush commander did not initiate within the next reasonable window, I was going to do it myself. A single shot would at least wake everyone up. We could establish the facts afterward. This had seemed, at the time, like a rational assessment of the situation. I was wrong about that in a way I was now understanding with considerable clarity, in real time, as a family of campers walked through my cut-off zone with their pots and their argument and their exhausted child, none of whom had any idea that they were doing so. I put the safety catch back on. What happened next along the line was not a sound, but a quality. A change in the texture of the silence, moving from right to left, person by person, as each man registered what had just happened and completed his own private assessment. Nobody spoke. Nobody needed to. The collective exhale was not audible, but it was absolutely present, the way relief is present, not as a thing you hear, but as a sudden reduction in atmospheric pressure that you hadn't noticed was there until it was gone. The family walked on. The pots faded. The child's footsteps were the last thing to disappear. 15 minutes later, the real enemy came in from the right. The string moved. The ambush went off without incident, which is the correct outcome and the one that appears in the official record. The debrief made no mention of the family. This is because soldiers are, in certain respects, rational creatures. And a rational creature does not volunteer information whose principal effect is to invite questions about why the left-hand cutoff had his safety catch-off before the right-hand cutoff had pulled the string. I will note only this. It is fortunate they came in from the right. Because if they had come in from the left, their evening would have gone very differently. Not fatally, we were firing only blanks, and the greatest risk to the campers was cardiac rather than ballistic, but differently enough to have required a quantity of explaining I was not, at that moment, equipped to provide. And they would not have been the only ones that night with brown trousers, though in our case, the Arctic rations would have taken the blame. Sometime later, in Belize, I encountered the second half of this story, though I did not know at the time that it was a second half of anything. The army had spent several months preparing us for jungle warfare by having us run long distances in the United Kingdom. I have thought about this preparation occasionally since, and have never been able to make it add up. The fitness required to move through jungle is not aerobic capacity. It is not the ability to cover ground quickly. The jungle does not permit covering ground quickly. The jungle is a place where the ground covers you, gradually and thoroughly, if you give it half a chance, and what it actually demands of the men moving through it is the considerably less glamorous capacity to keep going indefinitely, at low speed, in high heat, under constant harassment from an ecosystem that has had considerably longer than you to develop opinions about large mammals blundering through it. Running around a BFT route in a polite UK garrison town, whose youth element is admittedly less polite, does not specifically prepare you for this. It prepares you, efficiently, for running with sufficient apparent fitness as to deter aggression. What the jungle teaches you instead, and fairly quickly, is the value of systems. Small, practical, unglamorous systems. It is here that string once again plays a part. Things might be different now in the day and age of thermal drones and Uber Eats. But back then, a platoon harbour in jungle was set out as a triangle. The perimeter of this triangle was marked at chest height by a length of string threaded between the trees. Not a boundary in any structural sense, but the practical green garden centre variety. The kind of thing that would not detain a determined dog. The function of this string was navigation, not security. In darkness that has extinguished every available photon, a man cannot see the string. He walks into it, and he knows where he is. The centre of the triangle is the platoon headquarters, which is a kind of creche for Ruperts and signallers run by a senior NCO. Being a contained boundary, it is impossible for anyone inside the harbour to exit without walking into the string. It is therefore what keeps even the least experienced from wandering into the jungle for a piss and never being seen again. At each apex of the triangle lay a sentry position about 30 metres or so out from the apex, again marked by a string. Along each edge of the triangle, between the apex stag positions, the men laid out their bashers in a line. The convention was that where the stag strings meet the triangle apex, a number of light twigs are tied into the stag line with clove hitches. The number of twigs delineates which section of the platoon is responsible for that stag position. The bashers for that section being those that are on the anti-clockwise side of the triangle. In this way, men can easily find their way in the dark from their sleeping bag to the stag position and back. They can also find their stag relief easily, since it is the next man down on the line from their own bivvy, or first position on the line if they are the last. Some schools of thought dictate tying additional single twigs into the harbour boundary line at each sleeping position to more readily identify a bed that might otherwise be easily missed in the dark, or, alternatively, just count the number of oofs and fucks you hear as you stand on them on the way through. Going out to stag and coming back in the dark, a man can read his position by feel. If stag is a staggered hour, with switches every 30 minutes, there is always at least one sentry on duty during the night, with his buddy either doing stag along with or making his way to or from the basher line, waking their relief before heading to get some sleep. The more efficiently this can be done, the more sleep everyone gets. Staggering the stag also has the benefit of ensuring that at least one of the two sentries at each position has their full night vision and wakefulness at any time. I mention this system in some detail because what follows is not a story about that system failing. The system did not fail. The system worked exactly as designed. It is a story about a man who walked through the system as though the system had been put there for someone else, and what the system's immediate environs thought of this. It was dusk, not dark. Dusk, the particular quality of fading light in which a man in a beret moving through trees is perfectly visible to anyone paying attention, and a sentry, by definition, is paying attention, which is the entire point of a sentry. Lieutenant Colonel Willoughby. This was not his name, but it has the appropriate assonance, implying as it does a man who arrived in the army via a route that involved horses, and has been mildly surprised, at intervals since, by the more functional aspects of the profession, was a former artillery officer, which in an infantry context is a detail that requires no elaboration. He was well-meaning, enthusiastic, and possessed of the settled conviction that the procedural architecture that governs how soldiers move around each other in the field is a thing of great importance, clearly intended for the benefit of everyone and naturally not applicable to himself. He came through the trees in that half-light, making the noise of a man who is going somewhere and considers the distance between himself and his destination a formality. The sentry saw him, recognized him, experienced the specific paralysis that grips a junior soldier when correct procedure and the presence of a commanding officer arrive in the same moment and require the same response, the sudden, vertiginous question of whether following the rules, in this instance, constitutes a kind of impertinence. There was a pause. Then, to his very considerable credit, the sentry did his job. "Halt! Who goes there? Forward one, and be recognized." The ancient formula, unchanged, unarguable, as applicable to a lieutenant colonel in a beret as to anyone else approaching a position in failing light. Willoughby did not halt, did not come forward one, did not engage with the call and response that the formula requires, and that exists precisely because the alternative is a man with a weapon making unilateral decisions in poor visibility. He simply continued, in the manner of a man who has decided that the procedure is addressed in some general and theoretical sense to someone else. He did not realize we had a snake on stag, which, to be fair, neither did we. But it had clearly been briefed on that night's password protocol, because the shriek as it sunk its little fangs into Willoughby's hand was impressive. It struck with the decisive efficiency of a creature that has not been briefed on, nor has an understanding of rank structure and has no particular interest in acquiring one. Willoughby was evacuated from the jungle with a speed reminiscent of those aforementioned Arctic rations exiting our bowels. The snake, to the best of anyone's knowledge, was entirely unharmed, as, for the most part, was the CO. The snake, as it turned out, not being venomous, nor the CO poisonous. I have thought about the two incidents together, more than their surface similarities might seem to warrant. A killing zone in Wales and a jungle harbour in Belize have very little in common as settings. A family of campers and a lieutenant colonel have very little in common as protagonists, but they share a structure that I find, the more I turn it over, to be something more than coincidence. In both cases, something had moved through a position it did not have full situational awareness of. In each scenario, systems were in place and functioning, in one case protecting the innocent, and in another punishing arrogance. Strings vibrating, or not, sometimes that's all that separates one from the other. The elemental physics of the universe is some way beyond this old soldier. The Greeks would have called this dike. Not justice exactly in the legal or moral sense, not a verdict, not a punishment, not a reward, but the older, more impersonal principle of balance. In both situations, a nemesis had arrived that corrected any hubris in evidence with the impersonal efficiency of an external force of nature that does not negotiate. The campers never knew they had been inside anything. They were innocent, and Dike protects fools with small children without consulting them on the matter. Which is probably for the best, because said consultation would probably have raised questions that would have been difficult to answer at 2 in the morning on a coastal footpath. Willoughby, I assume, knew what had bitten him. Whether he understood what it represented is a different question. He had walked through a clear challenge in sight of a sentry who had done everything correctly, and the universe had sent a local representative to register an opinion. Nemesis, when she arrives, does not experience the paralysis that afflicts junior soldiers in the presence of the boss. She simply acts on what she finds. The string was there for a reason. It is always there for a reason. The system that marks the boundary, that tells you where you are in the dark, that stands at chest height between the known and the unknown. It is not decorative. It is not theoretical. It is not addressed to someone else. This is not a lesson. Lessons are for debriefs, and the debrief on the ambush contained no mention of a family on a footpath for reasons that should by now be apparent. It is simply an observation. Whether we know about the strings orchestrating the universe around us is not always important. The point is, they exist, whether we acknowledge them or not.